One of the things that I often say is I tend to think of marketing in a way as dating, you know.
Mm.
And I imagine that no one really comes back after a first date and says, "Hey, I had this great date last night. This guy, he was really serious and worthy," you know. Whereas I'd imagine, a girl might come back after a great first date saying, "Hey, I had this great date last night. This guy, he was just really funny, made me laugh."
Welcome to What Gets Measured, a NinjaCat podcast about marketing, performance management, metrics, and effectiveness. Because what gets measured gets managed. I'm your host, Jake Sanders. Patrick Gilmore is the marketing director and head of humor at Studio Gilmore, a creative consultancy out of the UK that helps global brands inject the power of humor into their communications. He has nearly 2 decades experience working in advertising as a copywriter, creative, communications executive, and strategist, and he's here today to tickle our funny bone about humor in marketing. Patty, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Jake?
Excellent. So happy that you were able to join us, and love
Thank
your
you.
work. Big fan of the stuff you put up on LinkedIn. Really genuinely funny, thought-provoking stuff. So I know you're not only talking that talk, but you're walking that walk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So let's talk about this path. Give us a rundown of your experience in marketing and advertising, and tell us how you came to find humor as the next step in your evolution.
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back almost 25 years. I did my master's in history of art, and one of the kind of key things I looked at during my master's was looking at how avant-garde art groups use humor. They use humor as a technique. And so I investigated it and I researched it. And I just found it really, really interesting. And then I also I studied a lot of Andy Warhol during my master's. So I thought, okay, the next step seems to be advertising, a logical step.
Right.
I basically went into advertising thinking it was all about making funny ads.
Right.
And then I discovered that yes, sometimes it was, but sometimes it wasn't. But I kind of kept this interest in humor alive, and I did a lot of research and reading into humor theory and mechanisms and the philosophy of humor. And it's a fascinating area because it's, the past 20 years has exploded in terms of our knowledge about what humor is and how it works.
Right.
And in particular, how it works in marketing communications.
Right.
So then, a year or two ago, I thought to myself that a consultancy that looked exactly at how brands can use humor best would be, a really nice asset, for a number of brands.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Yeah, and it's interesting that you make that Andy Warhol connection because, he was an artist, but he also saw himself as this, he had, his shop that he had set up. So I mean, that's in its own kind of way a creative agency, and he was big on taking advertising and turning it into this pop sensible sort of commentary. So it's very interesting that you linked in on Andy Warhol. And speaking about art and, modern art, that's one of those things that kind of seems esoteric in a way, and but also universal. And jokes seem to kind of ape that a little bit. They're universal, but they can also be extremely inside baseball, requiring a ton of context and knowledge. How do you square this reality with applying humor in advertising or brand communication?
Well, I think a lot depends on where the brand is, where the audience is, and the actual communication they're trying to make. It might be, say, a one-off communication, or it might be an entire advertising campaign.
Right.
I think one of the things about humor is that it's a very peculiar kind of phenomenon whereby it is a universal trait, but it's very unique to individuals.
Yes.
And that paradox is at the heart of humor. The way a brand can use humor well, and this is what I kind of work with brands on, is looking at common themes within the brand, the audience, and the object of the humor. So that can sometimes that's often what's termed the butt of the joke.
Right.
So I kind of basically look at those commonalities. I'll typically look at demographic and psychographic kind of evidence and find out how close we can make those. And the closer they are, basically the more certain we can be of success in using humor.
Right. And that's interesting. Are there a lot of suppositions there? Just saying like, well, this is a demographic, they're 35 to 60. I mean, we're making a generalization there, but
Yeah.
some of those things have to be unpacked. Do you test some of these ideas before? And what's most
You can test them,
interesting?
yes. Yeah, you can do that. And there's also there's something called the Humor Styles questionnaire, which is a great questionnaire
Oh,
for
cool.
understanding the audience. It's a 32 question survey, and it's been proven to be really, really useful. So that's something you can use. There's lots of different tools that psychologists have developed over the past decade or two. One is called the Need for Levity questionnaire, and these tools, I think, can and should be used more within advertising, because it'll give advertisers a far better knowledge of whether humor is appropriate or not.
Wow. And thinking about appropriate, most businesses are very serious about
Mm,
business. This is
mm,
business, So incorporating humor seems like a cheapening of their seriousness. It seems like you're just clowning around. What do you
mm.
say to that line of thinking?
I would say that it's in a funny way, the more serious a subject, often, the more useful humor is. A great example of this is comic relief. Now, comic relief started in the late 1980s. It was like a
Love it.
kind of a branch of like Live Aid. And what they do is every year there's one particular day in which in UK in which millions of pounds is raised for aid to go to developing countries. Now, if you think about it, it's quite a distressing cause. Looking at people suffering from famine and disease and drought
Right.
in many of the most poorest countries in the world. So by allying that with comic relief, by using humor as a way of getting the message through, it means that every year we tune in, we watch the TV program or the programs, and we donate, I don't know, 10, £20, $10, $20, whatever it might be.
Right.
And that kind of helps to kind of raise funds. I mean, humor is great at doing that. It's great at
Mhm.
sweetening the pill. Yeah, definitely.
I'm interested to hear, um, like maybe some examples of clients that took the punchline across the finish line and saw like measurable results when they used humor. And also, what are there any like horror stories you have from maybe not your own clients or previous folks? Is there any like some good stories about it working and then some bad stories about it not working?
Sure, sure. There's a few. I think a really great example of a brand that have taken humor and used it really well is a British tea brand called Yorkshire Tea.
Yeah.
Obviously based in Yorkshire, and going back about 6 or 7 years, they were fifth in their category. They had a market share, I think, about 13%, and the two market leaders were neck and neck. They're PG Tips and Tetley.
Yeah.
So Yorkshire Tea decided they would go for a really good, funny route. They called it the proper cup route,
Right.
and this involved using kind of Yorkshire celebrities and advertising their products within the UK. If we now fast forward 6 years on, they leapfrogged their two rivals and they're now market leader.
Wow.
It's been a phenomenal campaign, and a really good, standout brand. So that's a great example of using humor well. A
Yes.
great example of when humor hasn't gone too well is a brand you might remember yourself. It's called Just for Feet,
Oh, yes.
which were yeah. So in the late 1990s, they were doing extremely well. They had sales of about $775 million a year. And there was one Forbes article on them which said they were the sixth fastest growing company in the US.
Okay.
In other words, everything seemed to be going very, very well. You
Right.
wanted your a new pair of Adidas or Nike trainers, you go on to Just for Feet.
Right.
They then broadcast an advert during the Super Bowl in 1998, which featured a barefoot black runner running through what looked like an African landscape. He was then drugged by a team of white hunters and dragged off, and they then put some running shoes on him. It was definitely not the right thing to do at all. They thought it was intended humor. It was actually horrendous.
God, no.
What was interesting is the company themselves, they admitted it was racist. However, what they then did was blame their advertising agency, who is Saatchi, saying that it was their fault.
Wow.
Long story short, the company filed for bankruptcy a year later.
No
Uh,
way.
and many people say it was that advert, which is still online. You can still see it, and it is shocking. You know,
Well, and I think some horror story like that is a positive indicator for someone saying, "No way are we going to joke about this stuff." You know, there's no way that we're going to be able to do that. Like, we will fail. Like, and I think a lot of people are missing the point of humor as sort of it's a litmus test sometimes. You say, are you with me? Are you with me here? You know, and a lot of
yeah.
people don't want to put themselves in a position where they have to like walk back an idea or something like that. I mean, do you see like this is an example of, sure, Yorkshire tea can get Patrick Stewart to, you know, or David Beckham or something like that. Like, of course that worked. You know, they paired it with, you know, some known stuff and it worked. But there's also this example of humor being a horrible, hot, behind the ear fail, you die on stage. And you know, if you're a comedian, you have a good audience, it works. You know, you have a bad audience, it doesn't work, but it's the same, you know, routine. I think there's, you know, there's something that's built in the resiliency of comedy that isn't built into the resiliency of business.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the thing about humor, I mean, one of the things I tend not to talk about are things like jokes and comedy, because it's not like you're kind of getting a belly laugh at an audience.
Hmm.
You know, that can lead to what's called the vampire effect, which is whereby people remember the joke but forget the brand.
What?
And that is, a common fear, but one that can be countered, using different methods. Um, I The way that I define humor in terms of how humor works with brands, it is interacting playfully with the audience. And it is that playful interaction which I believe brands really need. I think part of it is because over the past decade or so, brand purpose has become it's become very, very dominant. And I think a number of brands are thinking, okay, either it hasn't worked for us, or we've just kind of mined all we can within that area. We feel we need a bit of a change now,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And often using humor is the best way to kind of get out of there. Because what you're doing is you're saying, we're having a relationship with our customers, and we're going to entertain sometimes, and we'll happily entertain them. And I think it's that sense of just being kind of normal and entertaining, which is important.
I think it's something you bring up a really interesting point, and it's sort of to a previous question of saying like, you don't cheapen our seriousness. We're a
Mm,
business. We're
mm,
we're sort of like we're not for the common person. We're of a different cloth,
sure.
and I think that's interesting that you just be normal, guy.
Mm,
Like
yeah.
like I
Yeah, oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I often say is I tend to think of marketing in a way as dating,
mm.
and I imagine that no one really comes back after a first date and says, "Hey, I had this great date last night. This guy, he was really serious and worthy," you know. Whereas I'd imagine, a girl might come back after a great first date saying, "Hey, I had this great date last night with this guy. He was just really funny, made me laugh," you know.
And it's so weird that people don't want to consider being likable. Is
Mm,
humor this way to get into likability? I mean, like, uh, I, you know, I remember some, Aaron Berg Bass thing or Les Binet or whatever, but it was like, no, it was Paul Feldwick,
mm,
basically talking about being likable. Like, just
yeah.
be likable. Like, everyone's trying to convince of, again, you said purpose. We stand for this, and 10% of our stuff goes to the mini marmosets of Brazil. And you're
Mm-mm.
like, well, okay, great. But you're like, do I like that? am I
Yeah,
interested in
exactly.
continuing a conversation with you?
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's something about that where people are like, we don't want to be liked.
Yeah, I think it's that. I mean, humor is very, very likable, obviously. This is why jokes spread. This is why funny stories go around. And this is true of stuff on social as well. It's definitely
Right.
true. But there's another side to it, and I think this is a side that isn't as well known as it could be, which is that I mean, if you go back in 2009, there was a German academic did a big meta-analysis, so a huge big analysis looking at the relationship between humor and advertising, and he looked at 39 academic papers on this,
Mm.
and and his question was, what is that relationship? You know, is there a relationship there? And he discovered three things. He discovered that humor makes the brand more memorable, it makes the advert more memorable, and above all, it makes people more likely to buy.
Mm.
So if a brand decides to use humor, they're not just going to be more likable. You know, there's that important thing whereby it's been shown it makes people more likely to buy the product or service. And that, I think, I mean, for me, what I like to do is look into that the kind of the scientific side of it. You know, the whole kind of academic proof behind it, because we all know that humor is wildly attractive,
Right.
but it's finding the actual, you know, the actual academic proof is extraordinary, and it's ever expanding. We are finding out more and more and more about how humor best works within advertising, you know, as each month passes.
So have you ever had an experience, you don't have to name names, but with a client where they're like, this is funny, and you have to talk them out of it, or have like really the one of the barriers is to getting a campaign or one of those one-off communications approved is that the
Mm,
client has to think it's funny, but really it's the audience that needs to see it as humorous. And how do you
mm.
deal with that dichotomy? And do you ever talk people off of cliffs, or just kind of like lightly touch on your experience with that?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, you have to go, you know, delicately. But I think, I mean, you know, I mean, what I do say is, okay, let's thoroughly research this before we, you know, actually kind of green light this.
Right.
Let's, you know, maybe do like a kind of focus group. I've done that in the past. Let's see how people react. Maybe do like a bit of a
Yeah.
monkey group, that kind of thing. Just to kind of get a bit of a sense of where it could go. I think it's also useful to suggest alternatives, you
Mm.
know, to say, you know, that there's alternative avenues that we can go down which use humor, but maybe in a slightly different way.
Right.
I've done
Um,
that.
but I mean, have you ever had to tell somebody that they thought something was funny and you're like, man, that's all fraught. Like, don't go there.
I have, not in those words, but I have.
Well, and then again, you really have to be delicate, regardless of if you're trying to use humor. Just any ad agency or consultancy needs to be very delicate. Like I got to get a little bit of approval from the client, but I also have to have that faith, and maybe
Yes.
faith in humor seems less of a sure bet than faith in seriousness. And
Mm.
do you light a votive candle, or do
Yeah,
is there?
well, yeah, possibly. I mean, it's funny because it's funny. I don't tend to think of it as faith in humor. I tend to think of it more as kind of our ever increasing knowledge of humor. You
Mm.
know, it's really something which psychologists and sociologists and philosophers and whatever have studied so much more in the past 2 or 3 decades
Mhm.
that, I mean, humor studies is a boom industry right now.
Mm.
You know, there are a lot of really interesting academics working in this area. So my argument is really less the kind of faith-based one, more the knowledge-based. This is what we know so far. We don't know the entire map, but we know enough whereby we can navigate through this territory in a safe and intelligent manner. And that means it's well worth doing.
Man, I love that, because I also think as a creative, you get frustrated with an idea and say, just trust me. Just trust me. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
be great. They're going to love it. It's really, but you're using an angle of saying, no, no, no. I don't think I want your faith or your trust. What I need you
Mm-hmm.
to do is understand that there is a ground reality here that's been studied ad nauseum from people who really take communication seriously. And that's what we're folding in. rather than just trust me, which I think is like the death of a
Exactly.
creative and the beginning of like a really contentious relationship. Like, why don't you just trust me? It's going to be
Yeah.
funny, you know? And you're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you're not funny right now.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's very interesting. Recently I was reading that the number of academic articles that were written that included the words laughter and humor in their titles. The number of articles that were written between 1900 and 1909, we know of only 2 articles. In the same years, 100 years on, so between 2000 and 2009, there were 440 articles written. So that's an increase of 21,900%. I worked out.
So,
It's extraordinary.
where do you think this is coming from? Are people, why are people looking to humor to study it, to understand
Oh,
it? Like,
it's interesting. I mean, a major force behind it is there was a book that came out in the 80s by a guy called Martin Seligman, and it was called Positive Psychology. And his argument was that psychology up until then had looked at pathological issues. So when things go wrong. And his point was, why don't we look at, what healthy psychology looks like? And this basically led to people looking more into humor, because, people thought, okay, what is a link between humor and well-being?
wow.
And basically that kind of set the ball rolling. As it's gone on, there's been a wider view of humor, the idea that humor can be benign and very much is benign, but it also possibly has a darker side to it. It's extraordinary because it's capable of obviously causing incredible joy, but incredible distress.
Right.
And sometimes this exactly the same, human performance can do that. So there's a sense that, okay, we have this phenomenon. It's universal. We need to know more about it, and how can we chart it? And I think it's the fact that it's ancient, and yet it still remains under researched. But that research is increasing dramatically.
Yeah, no, yeah, and you're bringing like people have been joking since the cave days.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
the first knock knock joke was on a rock wall. But no, you also made me think, and I heard this in college because for my whole life they were like, Jake's he doesn't know the difference in between playtime and work time. and,
Mhm.
I'm like the class clown, and so I just like honked my nose, and I was like, "What are you talking about? Give a buzz handshake, smell my flower. Here's a squirt of water." Um,
Okay.
but in college, someone said intelligence is this place where humor comes from. Like you have to be pretty intelligent to understand. Of course, if
Mm.
somebody gets kicked in the balls, we're laughing. It's more of like a kind of Three Stooges approach. But then there's more
Yeah. Yeah.
cerebral stuff that maybe you get from the Marx Brothers. And I remember kind
Mm.
of struggling with this because you really do have to be highly intelligent. A lot of comedians and people who believe in humor are vastly intelligent,
Mm.
but it
Mm.
still seems like, well, you all are being dumb. And I think like what you're saying is that there's been such a big, animus from, the academics to study this thing because it does require intelligence. I mean,
Mm.
what do you think about that dichotomy there?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, it's interesting. I think there were 2 reasons why academics didn't want to study it. If we go back, say, 40, 50 years. The first reason was it was seen as being a bit frivolous. It's been like, oh, it doesn't really matter that much. And the second reason was, and the simple truth about it is humor is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. You know,
Mm,
it is not a simple thing. I'm not saying that to kind of, trumpet up, the fact that what I do is very complicated, but it is quite complicated in many ways. And it dips into cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology, lots of different areas. And so because of this, many psychologists shied away from it. But that has obviously changed.
right.
I mean, to your point about intelligence being very important, it is very important, but there are forms of humor. Arousal safety, for example, is a humor mechanism which looks at it's very much like an emotional one.
Mm,
And this is the kind of humor that we laugh at when someone avoids a near miss, or someone has like a near miss in something. That is, in a way, it's not intelligent in a cognitive way, it's intelligent in an emotional way. There's lots of different forms of humor. And I think this is one of the things which I try and convey to my clients, is that, there's so much here to choose from. There's so many different directions you can go in, it's really quite, a lot bigger than a lot of people think.
That's amazing. We could talk forever about this stuff, and you've given us so many good examples of, jokes that work, jokes that don't, jokes that open up doors for serious concepts, like comic relief and those things. Like, so many great ways to approach this. And I'm going to get links for all these, things that you've mentioned, so we can provide them in the show notes. But if you had to boil it all down and you had to give one piece of advice when it comes to humor and marketing, what's the main takeaway for the audience?
I think what I would say is, put your fears and preconceptions to one side. Sometimes, they're groundless. Sometimes they're realistic, but they might be over dramatized. So I would say it's good to kind of go in with an open mind, and good to kind of, examine humor as a way of speaking to the colleagues, the friends, to your audiences as a marketer, which is refreshing. And I think that's often my starting point. And then from there, we then kind of start to dig deeper into, the kind of humor that a brand wants.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking right now of like a toast at a wedding. Usually, no matter what, somebody starts with a bit of a joke, kind of break in there. And, it's such a powerful thing to just kind of get on a ground level with people. Let's laugh a little together.
Sure.
And maybe people are a little afraid of that, but they shouldn't be. And if they really want to be serious about humor, they need to talk to you, because you're the man, and with a plan.
Thank you.
It doesn't depend on faith and trust, which I'm slapping my head like, what do you mean, trust me? No. You're not going to get that. But if people want to learn more, follow you online, connect with you, Patty, where can they do that?
Thank you. Yeah. So my site is studiogilmore.com, which is studiogilmore.com. And I also tweet at Mr. Paddy Gilmore, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Cheese or chocolate?
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Cheese or chocolate?
Cheese.
Paul or John?
Paul.
One-liners or long form?
Long form.
Robin Williams or Richard Pryor?
Richard Pryor.
Rubber chicken or whoopee cushion?
Whoopee cushion.
And finally, laugh crying or cry laughing?
Cry laughing.
What Gets Measured is a NinjaCat podcast. Please rate and review the show wherever you find your podcasts. Share this episode on social, and visit us on the web at ninjacat.io.